Welcome to this week's Midweek meditation. There's been a lot in the news recently about wildfires in Europe. Tourists have had their holidays ruined and homes and businesses have been destroyed. It paints a pretty bleak picture, but amongst it all there have been a few positive stories. The man who used his hire car to ferry groups of people out of the affected area, and the local families who took stranded tourists into their homes and gave them food and a place to stay. It's a recurring theme whenever we read about disasters of various kinds. There are always some people who are willing to step up and help others who find themselves in need. Sometimes they are called Good Samaritans, and that brings us to the theme for this week's meditation. We started to look at the fruit of the Spirit in church and began with love. There are different types of love, but the focus is on agape love, which is the type of love that Jesus demonstrated when he died for us. We need to remember that he was fully human as well as fully God, and he really didn't want to die in such a painful way. It says in Luke chapter 22, verse 42, that he prayed, "Father, if you will, take this cup of suffering away from me." It says that he was in great anguish, but because of his great love for us all, he continued to pray, "Not my will, however, but your will be done." This is the ultimate example of agape love. Earlier in Luke's Gospel, in chapter 10, verse 25, it tells us that a teacher of the law came up and tried to trap Jesus by asking him a question. "What must I do to receive eternal life?" Instead of answering him directly, he got the man to think for himself. He replied with quotes from the Old Testament and said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbour as yourself." Jesus agreed and said, "Do this, and you will live." However, this wasn't enough for the teacher of the law. It says he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus another awkward question. "Who is my neighbour?" This time Jesus replied with a story. We know it as the parable of the Good Samaritan. It is a very familiar story to many of us, but it is important because it helps us to understand what agape love involves. As I mentioned at the beginning, the term Good Samaritan is a phrase that most people have heard of, even if they don't have a Christian background. Let's remind ourselves of the story. There was once a man who was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when robbers attacked him, stripped him, and beat him up, leaving him half dead. It so happened that a priest was going down that road, but when he saw the man, he walked on by on the other side. In the same way, a Levite also came along, went over and looked at the man, and then walked on by on the other side. But a Samaritan who was travelling that way came upon the man, and when he saw him, his heart was filled with pity. He went over to him, poured oil and wine on his wounds, and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own animal and took him to an inn, where he took care of him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper. "Take care of him," he told the innkeeper, "and when I come back this way, I will pay you whatever else you spend on him." There are a few things that we can take from this parable. Firstly, the man who stopped to help wasn't the one that you would expect. Surely it should have been one of the religious leaders who came to the man's aid, not a Samaritan. There was a lot of prejudice between Samaritans and Jews in Jesus' time, so most of his audience would have been shocked by this. But the point is that with agape love, there is no place for prejudice of any kind. When we dig deeper into the story, we can see that the Samaritan helped the injured man by sharing his time, his resources, and his money. Let's face it, he didn't have to stop. He was on a journey and he was probably keen to get to his destination. The last thing he would have wanted was to take time out to help someone. But when he saw the extent of the man's injuries, he decided to put himself out and spend time caring for him. He also shared his resources. He was carrying a kind of first aid kit of the time, oil, wine and bandages, and he quickly set about treating the man. Finally, he used his own money to pay for his care. He gave the innkeeper 2 silver coins up front and promised to settle the bill in full when he was on his return journey. Jesus said to the teacher of the law, "In your opinion, which one of these 3 acted like a neighbour towards the man attacked by robbers?" And he replied, "The one who was kind to him." Jesus said, "You go then and do the same." We don't know what the teacher of the law did. Maybe he was a bit annoyed that Jesus had got the better of him, or maybe he finally understood what loving your neighbour really meant. But that doesn't matter. What matters is our response. Our neighbour is anyone that we come into contact with in our daily lives. People at work, people at church, people in the community, or maybe even someone that we speak to online, or someone in need that we read about. Agape love means that we need to be prepared to get involved and use our time, resources and money to help. To finish, a simple example. A few years ago I was in Reading Town Centre when I saw a young child who was lost. She was clearly distressed, but no one was taking any notice. My first reaction? Should I get involved? What if people think I'm trying to abduct a child? Then I came to my senses. I knew I was a safe person, but what if someone less savoury than me saw an opportunity to intervene and lead that child away? So I stopped, stood in the middle of the busy street with people passing by on both sides, and held the child's hand and reassured her. It can only have been a few minutes before her panic-stricken mother appeared and the incident was over. It was a very small thing to do and only cost me a few minutes of my time. I didn't have to tend a critically injured man like the Good Samaritan did. But if I hadn't acted, there is a possibility that the incident could have ended very differently. So the challenge for us all this week is, are we prepared to get involved and truly love our neighbours?